Okay, welcome to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. I will start in a little over a minute and give some folks time to tune in. And you'll notice, of course, that we're meeting now on Thursdays at noon. But those of you who are going back to watch this video a little later on, you're realizing that these are all saved and archived on our YouTube page, our church's YouTube page, so you can watch at a more convenient time. But I'll start in a little over a minute. Okay, I am going to start. Welcome to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. Today we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 27. That's not quite the entirety of the gospel reading for this coming Sunday's lectionary cycle. I've trimmed it a little bit to focus on some key points in today's study. And of course, I'm back from vacation, so we're going to continue with these live stream Bible studies going forward. And again, they're always going to be now on Thursdays at noon. So I want to begin with the 3 P's: prayer, perspective, and pieces of scripture. And the first P is prayer. And I have a prayer to share with you from the World Council of Churches, and it's a prayer to pray during the pandemic. God of life, you have promised to be with us every day, also in difficult days, like in times like these. Give us clarity in our minds, strength in our work and discernment, rest as we sleep, peace in our souls. Be with those who need help more than we do ourselves, and help us to see what we can offer, empowered by your love. Amen. Okay, the second P is perspective, and today I want to draw a perspective from the late Oxford scholar Richard Thomas France, or R.T. France as he was known. He passed away recently in 2012, but he was a world-class Gospels scholar. And he wrote a powerful commentary on the Gospel of Mark, which is useful as we look at today's reading from the Gospel of Matthew. Now, why look at a commentary on Mark when we're looking at a text from Matthew? Well, today's story about Jesus walking on the water happens to be in both Matthew and Mark. It's also in the Gospel of John, but it's not in the Gospel of Luke. But because it's in both Matthew and Mark, sometimes I've found that when I'm studying on a particular passage, to look at a commentary from a different gospel that has the same story as the story I'm looking at in another gospel can be quite helpful. So in this case, it's R.T. France's commentary on the Gospel of Mark, and it's his commentary on this story of Jesus walking on the water. Now, what R.T. France deals with in his commentary is the issue of the miraculous. So, of course, Jesus walking on water is a miraculous occurrence. And the story just prior to this one in both Matthew and Mark is the feeding of the multitude. Again, another miraculous story where Jesus multiplies 5 loaves and 2 fish and feeds this huge crowd. And so the issue that R.T. France is dealing with is, did these two stories happen? Are they historically accurate? And one of the theories that he addresses in his commentary is what's called the sandbank theory. Now, this was a theory that was concocted in 1981 by a scholar named J.D.M. Derritt. And the sandbank theory, it deals with, again, this story of Jesus walking on the water. The sandbank theory says that Jesus didn't, in fact, walk on the water. Rather, he walked on a sandbank just below the surface of the water in the area where the Jordan River meets the Sea of Galilee and some sediment gathers. And because it was a nighttime storm, visibility was poor. The disciples couldn't actually tell that Jesus wasn't walking on the water, but he was only walking on a sandbank. They thought he was walking on the water, and they thought he was a ghost as a result. So this is the sandbank theory. The theory says, again, that Jesus is walking on a sandbank and not actually on the water itself. And there are similar theories to try to explain the multiplication of the loaves in the feeding of the multitude, where in fact everyone did bring some food with them. And when Jesus blesses the food that the disciples had brought forth, then it inspires everyone in the crowd to now share their food with each other. I think that is an implication of the story and a way to apply the story to today, but it's not explicit in the story itself. In the story, Jesus only has these 5 loaves and 2 fish. He multiplies them and then passes them out. And likewise, the implications about the miraculous are pretty clear in the walking on the water story. Jesus is walking on the sea is literally how Matthew describes it, not on a sandbank underneath the surface of the sea. So why do scholars bother with questions like these? And my personal response when I read a theory like the sandbank theory is, so what? Does it really matter if we have a naturalistic explanation of the walking on the water story? In fact, as I just mentioned, when you read the story in Matthew's gospel, and when you read it in Mark's gospel, and read it in John's gospel, in each one of these gospels, they make it pretty clear that Jesus is walking on the water, right? That this is a supernatural occurrence. It cannot be explained with naturalistic explanations. So this brings us back to R.T. France and his commentary on this story in Mark's version, in the Gospel of Mark. So R.T. France was skeptical of the sandbank theory because he followed a school of thought that is or has been known as narrative criticism. And narrative criticism is a fancy way of saying something that you've heard me say many times in this Bible study over the past few months. And basically what it says is that you appreciate the artistic or creative efforts of the gospel writers. You appreciate the story that they have told or the painting that they have painted. You appreciate it for its own quality. You don't try to pick it apart and say this part's not historical or that part is historical. It doesn't really matter. What matters is the presentation itself. So if you think about it as a narrative or you think about it as a work of art, you see these writers as almost like, again, artists painting on a canvas. And would you interrogate an artist after you saw their work? Would you interrogate them and ask them whether their depiction is historically accurate? Most likely you wouldn't, unless, of course, they're painting, say, a portrait of a monarch or a portrait of a president. You tend to want those to be historically accurate. But generally speaking, historical accuracy is not a key priority when it comes to art. And likewise, when you're reading something by a novelist, whether it's historically accurate is almost beside the point. You appreciate the story as it's told. And that's the focus of narrative criticism. And it's the focus of what R.T. France was getting at in his commentary. So art deals, as we know, with aesthetics, and it deals with one's own personal encounter with the piece of art or one's own personal encounter with the story as it's told by the novelist or, in this case, the gospel writer. So here's a short definition of narrative criticism. And it comes from a trusty handbook that I have, which is called Methods of Biblical Interpretation. And in it, it describes narrative criticism. And this is part of what that description is. Narrative critics, that is, scholars like R.T. France who use narrative criticism, narrative critics grant that biblical stories may function referentially as records of significant history. So there might be historical accuracy in the story. There might be. But they insist that these stories also function poetically to fire the imagination. Narrative critics are not interested in discerning the historical reliability of biblical stories. Rather, they're interested in determining the effect that the text, as it now stands, has on readers. Let me read that again. Narrative critics are not interested in discerning the historical reliability of biblical stories, but in determining the effect that the text, as it now stands, has on readers. So, we shouldn't be surprised then that R.T. France is skeptical of the sandbank theory and of other such theories that try to explain away the miraculous. Those issues are not even relevant to narrative criticism. It's almost like what people do when they try to explain the empty tomb in the Easter story, the resuscitation theory, for example, that Jesus didn't actually die. He sort of passed out and then came back to life. Those explanations don't really matter. You have to take the story as it's told, appreciate it for its narrative quality, for its artistic flair, and then focus on your own personal reaction to the story. So a narrative critic might say to a scholar who's trying to promote the sandbank theory, for example, what is it about this story that isn't sitting well with you that you need to concoct a theory like the sandbank theory in order to explain it away? So it's focusing on the encounter that the individual has with the story and not trying to pick apart the story itself, because picking apart the story gets away from appreciating the narrative and artistic quality of it. So we're going to look at today's reading from the Gospel of Matthew. Again, this is the walking on the water story. We're going to look at it today from the perspective of what is the effect of the story on us, the reader. So this is a narrative critical approach to the text. And this is almost always how I approach biblical stories, from a perspective of narrative appreciation or narrative criticism. So this brings us to the third P, which is pieces of scripture. And we are in the 10th Sunday after Pentecost in what's called, again, ordinary time. I've talked about ordinary time in the past, and it's based on the phrase ordinal numbers. So we are in the weeks where we're counting weeks. Every week that we move further away from Pentecost, we add another number to our ordinal numbers. So we are in the 10th Sunday after Pentecost, and we will continue to count Sundays all the way more or less until we get to the first Sunday of Advent at the end of the calendar year. But of course, Advent is the beginning of a new church year. And we are in lectionary cycle A. So the lectionary is a 3-year cycle, years A, B, and C. And A, B, and C correspond to the 3 synoptic gospels. Synoptic meaning seen together, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So year A is Matthew's gospel, which is why today's story and the previous stories from the gospels have come from Matthew's gospel, because we're in year A. Next year it'll be Mark's gospel, and the year after that it'll be Luke's gospel. So the lectionary readings for this coming Sunday that we're going to be focusing on in church come from Psalm 85, 1 Kings 19, and the story we're going to be looking at right now from Matthew chapter 14, and we're looking at verses 22 through 27. So I'm going to read those verses to you and then walk us through some key highlights from the text. Immediately he, Jesus, made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Okay, so before we dig into these specific verses, we should consider the context in which they're found. And that's always a good practice when you're reading a story or really any piece of scripture. You also want to think about it in its immediate context, then within the context of the larger book that it's found. And then if you really want to be bold, you think about it within the larger sweep of the biblical narrative itself, starting in Genesis and moving all the way through Revelation. So we'll do a little bit of that in just a bit. But this particular story comes just after the feeding of the multitude. And then that story comes just after Jesus has gotten word. This is the beginning of chapter 14 in Matthew's gospel. Jesus has gotten word that his cousin, John the Baptist, has been executed by King Herod. And of course, we know who John the Baptist is. John the Baptist was the one who baptized Jesus in the earlier sections of Matthew's gospel. And so this news comes as a bit of a shock to Jesus. And the way that Matthew tells the story, it seems like Jesus is trying to escape, to get off by himself where he can grieve and just spend time alone processing what has just happened. Unfortunately for him, the way Matthew tells the story, a crowd of people has followed him into this deserted place that he has tried to escape to. And instead of sort of sending them off or trying to hide again, Jesus instead showcases his selfless love and ministers to them. So what Matthew says is that Jesus had compassion for the crowd, and he spent the entire day healing their sick. Now, Matthew gives us a number for this crowd. It's 5,000 men, besides women and children. Now, that's an interesting way to describe the crowd. Why does he describe it as 5,000 men? He's not just being androcentric in the story. There is a specific reason, I think, why he refers to 5,000 men, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So we get to the end of the day. Jesus has spent the whole day with the crowd, healing their sick, and the disciples approach him and say, "This crowd is hungry, send them off so they can go buy food." And Jesus says to the disciples, "No, you guys feed them." And the disciples are like, "How can we possibly do that? All we have is 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And basically for Jesus, that's not a barrier at all. He blesses the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, starts to break them, breaks the loaves, hands the bread to the disciples, and then feeds the entire multitude, so much so that there were 12 baskets full left over at the end. Everybody got their fill, and there were leftovers. Then our story begins. And our story begins with a very curious expression. Verse 22 says, "Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds." So it raises the question, what's the sense of urgency here? Why does he immediately send them off? And in fact, the Greek here is forceful. And literally, it could be translated, immediately he forced the disciples into the boat and sent them off. Why the urgency? So there's an interesting possible explanation for the sense of urgency here, because you find the sense of urgency in the other 2 versions of this story as well, in Mark's gospel and also in John's gospel. And again, this story is not in, or the feeding of the 5,000 is in all 4 gospels, but the Jesus walking on the water is not in Luke's gospel. So we're in the walking on the water story, and that is not in Luke's gospel, but in the other 3 versions, Matthew, Mark, and John, the sense of urgency is prevalent. So this brings us back to what I mentioned a second ago about the feeding of the 5,000 men besides women and children. Why 5,000 men? And why 5,000? Why that specific number? Well, some people have suggested, and R.T. France is one of them, that there are militarized undertones in this story. So the number 5,000 and the reference to men is curious because the Roman legion, the army, the one unit of the army, a Roman legion was about 5,000 men. Also interesting in the story is that Jesus breaks this crowd apart, makes them sit down in the grass, and then, at least in the other versions of this story, not so much in Matthew's, but in the other versions, he breaks them off into these smaller units, almost like smaller military units. And then in this story, the feeding of the 5,000, more than other stories, Jesus uses command language. He commands the crowd to sit. He commands the disciples to do this. He's using forceful, direct orders. And then finally, in John's version of the feeding of the 5,000, that story ends with the crowd trying to seize Jesus and forcefully make him into a king. So this John's gospel makes more explicit than Matthew or Mark the militarized undertones in the story, and that the crowd wanted to make Jesus into this kind of militarized king, forcing him to be king. Now, one of the key themes throughout the Gospels is that Jesus is not that kind of king. He's not a militarized king. When he rides into Jerusalem, he's on a donkey. When he teaches the Beatitudes, he says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." He doesn't talk about making war. He's not that kind of king. And when he's interrogated by Pilate in John's Gospel, he says, "My kingdom is not from this world." So basically, you don't have anything to worry about when it comes to me. So he's not that kind of king, that kind of overt political king in the way that many in the crowd may have understood him to be or hoped that he would be. But, of course, the kingdom of God is a political kingdom. It's just not in the same way that you would have Herod's kingdom, for example, being a political kingdom. So, back to the sense of urgency. It's possible that Jesus is forcing the disciples into the boat and sending them off quickly and then dismissing the crowd, and then he escapes, which is what happens, and goes off by himself to pray. It's possible that all this happens so quickly with such a strong sense of urgency because the crowd is starting to churn and starting to want to move in the direction of making him into something that he was not ever going to be. And again, John's gospel makes that explicit. It's possible that it's implied here in Matthew's gospel. But in any case, this is a way to explain this sense of urgency right at the beginning of the story. Why immediately? And why does he force the disciples into the boat and send them away? Well, again, it's possible that the crowd was churning and trying to make him into something that he never was going to be. So that's the connection between the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on the water story. So Jesus does dismiss the crowd, and he finally, after all this time, gets some time alone, and he's praying. Not sure what he's praying about. The gospel writers are always ambiguous when it comes to telling us what Jesus is praying, except in the case of him teaching the disciples the Lord's Prayer. But when he's off by himself, he feels in his bones that the disciples are in trouble on the sea. So now we get to verse 24. I'm going to read it again. The end of 23 is, when evening came, he was there alone. Now verse 24. But by this time the boat, which had the disciples in it, the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. So this word battered here literally means tormented. They were tormented by the waves. Now, that is a very interesting word for Matthew to use, because it's a word that Matthew uses earlier in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 8. And it's also a word that appears in the book of Revelation at the end of the New Testament in chapter 14. And in both cases, this word torment, being tormented by something, is a supernatural kind of torment. In one, it deals with demons. That's in Matthew chapter 8. In the other, in Revelation, it deals with torment after death. Revelation, a bit graphic in that chapter 14. But in both cases, it's a supernatural kind of torment. that is an interesting way to think about these waves, because the story itself is extravagant, right? It's just like the feeding of the 5,000, and it's extravagance. It's extravagant here that Jesus walks on the water. And shouldn't it also, that extravagance, be met by extravagant supernatural waves? So I get the sense when I read this that Matthew is being artistic. He's trying to make this story more colorful and more vibrant by using this word. So these are supernatural waves that are tormenting the boat, and Jesus walks upon them to get to where the disciples are. It's just adding a whole layer of excitement and vibrancy to the story. Again, we're thinking about Matthew as a narrative artist, and we should expect these colorful pieces to be part of a colorful story. So that brings us to verse 25. And early in the morning, he came walking toward them on the sea. And I'm going to continue here. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." So the disciples see him walking on the water. They're terrified. They think it's a ghost, and they cry out in fear. Now, the supernatural waves that we just talked about are met by this supernatural activity of walking upon those very waves. And of course, the first response of these weathered fishermen, literally in the story they're weathered, but weathered by time, having spent time on the wind and with the wind and the waves on water, for most of their adult lives, even they're totally shocked. They've never seen anything like this. Jesus walking upon the water. Now, this walking upon the water is actually a common trope in the Old Testament. Yahweh, the Hebrew word for God in the Old Testament, or one of the Hebrew words for God in the Old Testament, Yahweh walks upon the water. It's one of the traits of Yahweh. Yahweh can control the sea in the Old Testament. So in Job chapter 9, it says, God alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea. Psalm 77, God made a way through the sea upon the mighty waves. Isaiah 43, God made a way through the sea upon the mighty waters. And then it's a different name for God in Genesis chapter 1, but the same theme is present, where in Genesis chapter 1, right at the beginning of chapter 1, you have these waters of chaos, and God tames the waters and then creates life. And in the ancient Near East, which is the context of many of those passages from the Old Testament, in the context of the ancient Near East, the ability to tame water was an attribute of the gods. So in the gospel reading for today, Jesus is, in a way, taming the water by walking upon it. Now, we can press this a little bit further. There's a comparison that some scholars have done, and one of them is this guy. His name is Mark Smith, The Early History of God, where he talks about the similarities between Yahweh in the Old Testament and other deities in the ancient Near East. They share attributes, and we should expect this because the writers who are talking about Yahweh in the Bible are product of their time and their culture in the ancient Near East. And so they're pulling in pieces from other things that they're familiar with and weaving them together to create this composite image of God in the Bible. So we should expect there to be some similarity between other ancient Near East deities and Yahweh. And indeed, there is. And one such similarity comes when you compare Yahweh and the storm god Baal. So we're not dealing with it during this Bible study, but one of the texts that we're going to read for this coming Sunday is First Kings chapter 19. And in that story, the Hebrew prophet Elijah has this competition with the prophets of Baal. And ultimately, Elijah wins, but really it's Yahweh that wins through Elijah. And the context of that story is that there's this drought in the land. And Yahweh is the only God powerful enough to bring rain. Baal, interestingly, was a storm god and should have been able to control the weather. But that story points out that Baal is not as powerful as Yahweh. Yahweh is actually the one who is the creator and sustains the creation, not Baal. So it's another example of taking attributes from one of the ancient Near East gods, in this case the storm god Baal, and saying, no, actually Yahweh is the one with those attributes, not Baal. Yahweh is the real God, you might say. So here again in the gospel story that we're looking at, Jesus is presented in this stream of theology. He's presented with the traits of Yahweh from the Old Testament. And if you're a gospel writer like Matthew, and you're trying to convey through story, through narrative, the impression that Jesus is the representation of God or the image of God on earth, then you are almost bound, because of that history in the Old Testament, you're almost bound to have a story in your gospel about Jesus being in charge of the sea. Because it's a common trope in the Old Testament. So if you're going to present Jesus as the representation of God, then in order to make that representation clear, you have to bring in this language from the Old Testament. You have to bring in this common trope of being able to tame the sea. So between the two stories, the multiplication of the loaves and the feeding of the 5,000 men, and the walking on the water in today's story, you actually have a connection between this set of stories and the book of Exodus in the Old Testament. So in the book of Exodus, the people of Israel are fed miraculously by manna, which is this wafer-like bread that God provides for them. So you have a bread miracle. And the people of Israel in the book of Exodus pass through the waters of the Red Sea and then on in the direction toward the Promised Land. So you have a sea miracle. You have a bread miracle and a sea miracle. In Matthew's gospel, you have a bread miracle, the feeding of the 5,000, and you have a sea miracle, the walking of Jesus upon the water. Bread miracle and a sea miracle. And there's another thing that connects this story explicitly with the book of Exodus and explicitly with Yahweh in the book of Exodus. So in Exodus chapter 3, when Moses encounters the burning bush, he meets Yahweh, and Yahweh introduces Yahweh's self as I am who I am. Well, in today's story, when the disciples are terrified, in verse 27, Jesus says, take heart, or be courageous. I am is actually what he says. Do not be afraid. He doesn't say it is I. He says literally, I am. That's the same two words that are used in the Greek version of the Old Testament when Yahweh introduces Yahweh's self. Yahweh says, I am. Same two Greek words. So you have all these interesting connections between the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on the water and various pieces of the Old Testament. So you have this common trope of Yahweh trampling the waves. You have the bread miracle and the sea miracle in the gospel, but also connects with the bread miracle and the sea miracle in the book of Exodus. And then you have Jesus introducing himself to the disciples as I am, in order to calm their fears. And that's exactly the same language that Yahweh uses in the book of Exodus. So the idea behind using all of this imagery is to be artistic. It's to be colorful in the presentation of this narrative about Jesus. It's to draw you in and to evoke all of these images of God from the Old Testament and to put them on Jesus, who's living into this representation of God on earth. And what Matthew is doing is portraying Jesus as having attributes of Yahweh in the Old Testament. It is an artistic representation of Jesus. But the bigger point that Matthew is trying to get across is that, um, who Jesus is matters, because Matthew is trying to get the disciples immediately in the narrative that he tells, but also we, the readers, he's trying to get us to follow this Jesus. And so by portraying Jesus with these traits or attributes of Yahweh, what Matthew is conveying is that Jesus is the image or the representation of Yahweh on earth, so that his teaching is divine teaching and his way is the divine way. So this is the way of love and compassion. So Matthew's point is follow Jesus, follow his way, follow his teaching. And I should add, when you read through the Gospels, Jesus never says, worship me, but he does say constantly, follow me. And so by painting this picture of Jesus in these two stories, Matthew is emphasizing the importance of following Jesus, because his way is the divine way. Okay, see you next week.